Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Jonathan Sides.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
And tonight we want to talk about what happened on January 6th, where a large group of people, and it was a large group of people, went to Washington, D.C. to protest the elections. And the net result was that a group of them broke into the Capitol. They overthrew the law enforcement. So many of these people are the ones who say that they're for law and order. They're the ones who have said with the protests going on in Portland and other places that we're supporting the police. And now all of a sudden they're rioting against the police as they're kept out of the building. So how as a nation did we get to this point?
Well, there's a lot of answers to that because there's a lot of reasons why we got to this point. And some of those reasons are very short term, like things happened the day of these riots that caused the riots, and you can point to those kinds of causes. The president said certain things. People got angry in certain sorts of ways. There were more people than there were police officers and law enforcement. But then to even get to the point where you've got an angry mob, a mob of people who thinks that this is an acceptable form of political expression, there's a whole set of reasons there that go back years and decades. And it all has to do with our view of the law. It has to do with our view of the worship of God, really. I mean, at the end of the day, we're a nation that has stopped acknowledging God as God. And because of that, and I know it's a long way from there, because we stopped acknowledging God as God, we're devolving into anarchy.
I think there's an important question to be dealt with first, which is, what was what went on yesterday good, particularly the most extreme parts of it. Going into this, I was thinking we would just kind of gloss over that completely, but then I was looking at an article this morning, and it was a poll from yesterday or this morning, I guess it was a poll from this morning, and 45% of Republicans said they supported the storming of the Capitol yesterday, which I would not have expected that. What went on yesterday, was that even good or was that bad?
And what we need to do, it was bad is the short answer. But I think what it comes back to is what Jonathan said, which is the law. If you don't believe in law, then you say it's okay to break the rules. And if you break the rules, it degrades into anarchy. I mean, that obviously is where there are no rules, right? That's anarchy, where there is no government constraint. And so I think as we talk about it, one of the important things to recognize is one of the things that's happening is that we're seeing a lot of anarchy in the country, and anarchy tends to breed anarchy. And so all of a sudden people are justifying breaking in, they're justifying forcing through the police line, they're justifying all this because they're saying other people are breaking the law. And that's a really dangerous view.
And part of it is for a while now there's been a concerted effort to blur the line between what is lawful and getting what I want to happen. And those things are trying to be made equivalent. Being lawful is doing what I really want to happen or what we all really want to happen. I mean, and like you can see it in cases, even in cases where like the police shoot someone. The question isn't what exactly did they do? What exactly happened? What exactly did they follow the law? The question is it doesn't matter.
Do I want the results we got?
This is horrible, and the result needs to be X. And that matters because, I mean, like when you talk about the election being legitimate, the legitimate means was it lawful? I mean, and that, and that really, that definition matters because when they went into the Capitol, that wasn't legitimate either because that wasn't lawful. And so, I mean, being lawful is kind of at the core of all this. But when you hear all these words, when I hear the word legitimate, my first thought isn't lawful. We've gotten to the point where the words don't mean what they really mean anymore. We don't think about the core of them and the heart of it.
So when there was the Queen of Israel, and they go and assassinate her and take her out, or they capture her, take her out of the temple and kill her, was that lawful? That's what people are saying is something illegal is happening, so we need to step up and take illegal action.
But there, I would say it was lawful, and it was lawful for some very particular reasons. In that case, a son of David was supposed to be on the throne, Athaliah. The Queen of Israel was not a descendant of David. She was not a legitimate ruler, and so they were overthrowing an illegitimate ruler. So it gets a lot more complicated a lot quicker. Now, in the United States, we have a different set of laws, and we have constitutions, and we have state constitutions and federal constitutions. We have courts, we have legislative branches. We have all these means to settle what is lawful and what's not lawful. And yesterday, they decided that they should use other means.
But I think there's a line that needs to be drawn here, because the American Revolution, there was no biblical divine right of kings saying William the Conqueror's descendant needs to be on the throne of England. So are we saying that all revolution is wrong, that you have to just go through your legal process?
But even there, they went through a legal process. They went through the lesser magistrates. They went through the legislative branches of the colonies. They went in a lawful way. They weren't pushing for anarchy, which is right now, it seems like there's a much bigger push for anarchy. A push for anarchy is without law. There is the doctrine of interposition that says a lesser magistrate can interpose themselves against an abusive greater magistrate. And that's what happened during the American Revolution. I don't see that happening here. Now, maybe I'm missing it, but it seems it's the opposite. They're going, the Senate and the House aren't going to do what we want to do, so we're going to storm the Capitol and stop them. That isn't organized. That's not accepting that you should be governed. That's anarchy.
There would be a time under the right circumstances where it would be right for say, President Trump, or not President Trump, but someone else, to lead a group of people and break into the Capitol and do certain things. But that's not what was happening. It was a group of people without any real aims, without any real goals, without any leader who was in an actual position of authority to be leading people, just breaking in, fighting with the police, taking selfies in Nancy Pelosi's office. I mean, they were just doing things that were not in any way...
And staying between the velvet ropes, right. Which is very odd.
Right. But they were doing things that were not trying to even overthrow the government. They were doing things that were just purely lawless.
And they were doing it specifically, I think, because the police told them they couldn't, and they were tired of being told, which doesn't make it legitimate at all. But I do think that that's... the riot police were trying to keep them back, and there was a big group of people, and they basically said, we're tired of being kept back.
So was it a lot of people now are saying it's just anarchists doing this, and this is just a false flag operation by someone. I mean, is there any legitimacy to that?
I don't think they carry that many flags. There was a large group of people. That is an enormous number of people to get that upset to go, and the way that it was organized. I mean, I don't know everything about it, but I would be hard pressed to argue that it was a false flag.
It was hundreds of people trespassing into the Capitol. I mean,
only a couple thousand, I think.
If not thousands. I mean, and it was many, many people. And
but the number that were in the mall, it was a tiny fraction of the number that were in the mall.
Sure, which is an important point. But like my brother was there, and there were not Antifa people going and everybody trying to hold them back. It's not what was happening.
Right. You either have a situation where I'm sure there'd be no surprise if there were Antifa people mixed in. So you either have a situation where the Antifa people did something and the Trump supporters gladly followed them, or you have it where they were all mixed up and they all did it at the same time. Either situation isn't good. And I think it's that there are people who they have this desire to believe some narrative that everybody that did it was an Antifa and yeah, nothing backs. I don't think there's anything I've been able to find that backs that up.
And having been to some of the Reopen NC protests, I mean, there were people there, maybe 1%, maybe more, who I would easily see breaking into the Capitol building. Right. It's a small number, but there were people there that they may have been in Washington D.C. breaking into the Capitol building. Right. Because there just are people associated that would do that type of thing with these type of groups.
And if you increase the size of the crowd by 250 or 500, a factor of that, all of a sudden that becomes easily 2,000 people.
Right.
I mean, you can easily have that.
This easily could have been 1 or 2% of the crowd, is what you're saying.
I think that's even the most likely scenario, is that it was 1 or 2% of the crowd.
And the fact that 45% of people are saying, I support this, of
that's
Republicans
scary.
are saying, I support this, means that even if they wouldn't do it themselves, the idea that it was Republicans doing it is not, it's what you would expect.
And you reach a point in countries where people start to, in countries that fall, where people start to identify more with their crowd than with the country. And we're seeing a lot more of that in the United States, where people identify as being Republicans or Democrats. I mean, this is, in the fall of the Byzantine Empire fell because there were 4 groups and they were associated with colors, and each one wanted their team to win and they could care less about the other ones. And it ends up that the whole empire falls. And we just have to understand that the history of this is pretty stark where this ends up. And so how do you solve it? How do you stop it from continuing in the path that it's going, where people are more concerned about their own partisan objectives and their party winning than they are law?
I mean, the easiest example is the gospel. Because people should not be associated, number one, with their country. People should convert to Christianity and associate with the church. Now, there are more levels to that we can get into, but I mean, we obviously will say people should become Christians and follow the church and follow God above everything else.
I mean, it is interesting that there's a theory that in Europe, the reason that there was World War I and World War II was because Christianity declined. And if there's no unity with Christianity, then what do you have unity with? Well, if you have a lot of different languages spoken, you have unity by language. And so that's the basis of most of the wars. When Germany invades, they're saying we need to take these German speakers and bring them back into Germany and make Germany united, because, it's the gospel is the reverse of the Tower of Babel. It brings unity among diverse people speaking different languages. And if you don't have it, it devolves like the Tower of Babel, where each group that speaks in its own language, they all go in their own direction. And it seems to me that that's one of the bases for this whole partisan divide, is that you don't have anything that joins two disparate people together, which is what the gospel does.
I think there's another thing. There's another form of the Tower of Babel, which is basically when everybody's lying. And there's a part of it where, I mean, and you know what I mean? And so, I mean, there's this aspect of, I think one of the things that's going on here is everybody, both sides seem to believe that you can say whatever you want to say, and as long as you say it long enough and loud enough, it becomes the truth. And so there's very little regard. I mean, I've read a lot of articles in the past 2 days, and I've compared it with video footage I've found. And I've seen people on both sides just flat out lie. I've seen them say, I went and verified this, and then I went and checked what they verified, and they were lying about what I've double checked this. This is absolutely true, and it's really easy to check. They are absolutely lying. And so, I mean, it's really hard to work in that environment as well. I mean, that is an environment that's as bad as one where all the languages are mixed up.
And when you create this partisan divide, everybody just hears their partisan side and they won't hear the other side. All the Democrats are hearing there was no widespread election fraud. The news media was saying that even before the election was over. There was no way they could possibly know. And the Democrats were saying, or the Republicans were saying the next morning after, in a couple states, large shifts happened overnight, the election was stolen. And they're all just listening to their own side, and they're not listening to the other side. And that's the huge division, the partisan division.
And neither side was really worth listening to. I mean, like,
neither side knew.
Right, neither side, nothing they were saying at the top levels was worth hearing, because they were just saying what they wanted to have happened.
Which is a rejection of the law.
Right.
And that's really important to remember. That is a rejection of the law. The law says you establish truth by 2 or 3 witnesses. None of these people were witnesses. None of them. And we still don't have witnesses.
Right.
We don't know what the truth is, as best as man has given to discern it, because we've become lawless.
So what about the hundreds of affidavits?
They have to be tested, because what does Proverbs say? That the one party sounds correct until he's questioned by his neighbor. And that process isn't being played out and hasn't been played out. And it's not played out because one side is saying the election was stolen. The other side is saying there's no widespread election fraud. There's no reason to listen to it. And so instead of actually dealing with real legitimate concerns, the other side, in both cases, the other side is just marginalizing and ignoring they won't listen and actually consider what the other side has to say.
So we're on we would be right wing by most people's definition. So what from the other side are we what should we be listening to, and the viewers be listening to that people are saying?
Yeah.
I mean, the first thing that I would say is you hear a lot of things about how the fraud happened, how these ballots shifted. Well, go back in 2016 and run the same statistics and see if they changed. Because what we're not willing to do is look at the other side, because the reality is that may have happened in 2016. Do you know what percentage of mail-in ballots were Democrat last time? Do we know? Do they go and say these 4 cities had this huge shift, unlike anything else ever. But did anybody go back and say, and this is what it looked like in 2016, this is what it looked like in 2012, this is what it looked like in 2008? Because you can lie with statistics, you can mislead with statistics so easily. And if you don't have partisan players that they just want their side to win, there's basic things you do for fairness, and there's basic things you do to be just. The churches stop speaking about justice. And so the society isn't just. We don't say, I'm not going to listen to this rumor about how this statistic proves this unless I check it and see is this a pattern? This might be what every election's like.
Right.
None of us at this table know. I haven't heard anybody try to do that analysis.
I work in the technical industry, and it's amazing how many times a process that people are very familiar with the process itself, when you make a small change to it and they start investigating, they find out huge things about that process that they were not aware of, even though it's something they've worked in sometimes for 30 years. They've done this process for 30 years, and they'll go, this never happens. This never happens. And then you go and you look, and it happens all the time. And so, I mean, that wouldn't be shocking. It wouldn't be amazing. But like you said, you have to go and look. You have to take the time. I mean, it's like Georgia. Georgia's been trending blue for a while. I mean, people have seen it happen, but all of a sudden they decide to put on a surprise. Oh, Georgia's, and act like they never saw this coming. With this, I mean, whereas if you talk to people who are really involved in politics, they weren't shocked at all. I mean, they saw this happening. They saw this happening over time, and they've been expecting it.
And if you look historically, the polls, the difference between the voters and the polls, there's usually about a 2%, 3% Democratic advantage in the polls versus the people who actually do the effort to go out and vote. So if you're the Democrats and you have zero desire to steal an election, you want to be honest and as fair as you possibly can, what do? You figure out ways to get the people that won't make the effort to vote to make it easier for them to vote.
Right.
Well, you send a ballot to their house.
Right.
It doesn't mean there were any fraudulent ballots. It could be everyone was legitimate. You just reduce the cost that it took for somebody to vote. You say, and I'm not saying it was legitimate the way they did this because most of this was against the law that they did.
Right.
But what they do is they say you don't need to get a witness signature. Well, if you don't need to get a witness signature, there's a bunch of people that would send in ballots that didn't otherwise because they're not going to go and show somebody their ballot and say that did this, right? And so if you're the Democrats, what you want to do is reduce the cost of entry because you know you have an advantage if you reduce the cost of entry.
Right.
And if you're Republicans, what do you want to do? You want to raise the cost of entry.
Right.
None of this requires fraud, but nobody knows the answer to that question. Did they just succeed in lowering the cost that it took to vote to the point where the Democrats win when in the national polls, they always show a lead anyway.
Right.
It's that you lose a few percent because Republicans are more likely to vote.
And that aspect of game theory is a really big part of election strategy. I mean, long-term election strategy and even short-term election strategy is really shaped by those different incentives and how you can the fact that you can spend 3 months voting now is a huge difference than if there's one day that the voting has to happen on. And so, it changes the dynamics of everything. You used to have to bus everybody in on that day. Well, that changes how many people you can get to the polls.
Right.
And the Republicans say, we only want people here who actually care about voting and are actually invested in the voting process. And that, And so
which could be legitimate too.
Right.
It's not, but the issue is what's the law? What is actually legitimate? What have we decided as a society and agreed through our representatives and the society? This is the way that we'll act.
Yep.
And so I think that what happens is the low propensity voter, give them 3 months to vote, and they're much more likely that one day they'll be sitting around going, I don't have anything to do. I'll go ahead and vote. While the guy who's 100% going to vote, you don't increase that side at all, but you increase the low propensity voter so that they vote. And so it's really easy if you're a Republican to go, they had to steal the election because there's all these extra votes, but nobody knows the answer. And all we're doing is, instead of actually searching out witnesses, instead of saying, how do you establish truth according to God's law? How do you get witnesses? How do you examine the witnesses? We have a whole court system, and I'm not saying the court system's legitimate because a lot of times what they go is these people aren't willing to be heard. They don't have standing. That's a problem as well if there's no recourse. And so people take other recourses. Not that it makes it right, but if you're not going to give them a recourse, they'll take other recourses.
Right.
And there's a lot of people out there who are believing conspiracy theories. I mean, that's what the media says, and they do not always know what a conspiracy theory is, but it is true. There are people who believe this stuff, and there's this whole thing about the Dominion voting systems, how they stole the election in Georgia. Well, the reality is they went back and they did a hand recount, and it was no votes were changed by the Dominion voting system. And people are out there saying it. Even the president is out there saying it. He still says it. And people are no longer caring, even when things have been checked. I mean, part of it is just kind of truth being relative used to be like a liberal concept, but it's becoming more and more of a widespread concept where people just don't believe everything they're being told. So they start to not even care if things are true anymore, and they only care if they're getting the outcome they're looking for.
And I mean, that's how we get here right now, is people stop caring about what's true. And when all you care about really is hearing what you would like to hear, or hearing things that confirm your already preconceived beliefs, or hearing things from your side, and not actually caring about, does this thing align with the truth? Well, that's how you get like this. That's how you get to the point where you have the balkanization of people groups. That's how you get to the point where you get marginalized voices. That's how you get to the point where, hey, if it doesn't really matter who's saying the true things, all that matters is who's the loudest and who can say it the most often and who can find the most media outlets.
And who can enforce it with the most power. We shouldn't forget
Right.
that element, because the power is a big part of this, right? That's why there's such a struggle, because both sides expect the other side to wield power because nobody cares about truth. And so they'll wield power unjustly.
Right.
And this is a really big, important issue. Inconsistent application of the law causes people to no longer trust that there's systems that will protect them. And we've seen this. We've seen this in the riots, where if somebody broke a window, they would get arrested, but yet you have the Black Lives Matter movement as a riot in downtown Portland, and they're burning buildings, and they're not really arresting anybody or doing anything, or they arrest them. Even the sheriffs in Portland are saying, we're not going in there anymore because we arrest all these people and they're just let go.
Right.
And so if you don't think you have a recourse in law, to some extent what they're saying is anarchy is already here. And if anarchy is already here, then shouldn't you defend yourself with force rather than saying the government's going to protect me? Because if you already have anarchy, the government's not your source for protection.
And let's just add in the hundreds, if not thousands, of people who committed crimes, most of yesterday in the Capitol building, most of which are going to get away with it.
Absolutely.
I mean, one of the things that goes on is, so people talk about it a lot, is hypocrisy. So everybody says, everybody's a hypocrite. Everybody's a hypocrite. But one of the things that hypocrisy causes is it causes you to stop focusing on, like what we've been talking about, on truth. Instead, what you focus on is what the other person got away with. And so instead of anybody looking at what's actually right, what you actually look at is, well, they got away with this, so therefore I have to be able to get away with this. So therefore I have to be able to get away with this, so I have to be able to get away with this. And like you said, it ends up becoming, when you have power, you try to do as much as you can with that power to get as much as you can, and then as soon as power swings in the other direction, they're going to use their power to get as much as they can. And no one's looking at what's right. But it starts with, in a sense, the hypocrisy, which starts with lawlessness. You know what I mean? And some of this goes back to even the lesser of two evils with voting. Is there's this part of it where when you don't look at principled voting, when you don't look at who you elect, what you look at is well, if we don't get somebody in who can have power and use power, then we lose. And so, I mean, you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And especially if you look at the greatest source of lawlessness in this country, I would actually argue it's executive orders. Right. Because we've eliminated the legislative branch as the main lawmaking branch of our country. And everybody went, President Obama, how can you legalize all these things that the Congress specifically said they were not legal immigrants? How can you do this and make these childhood arrivals to be treated as citizens, even though they don't get the vote, they get everything else? How can you do that? Because you don't have the power. You said multiple times you don't have the power. So then what does Trump do? Trump exceeds Obama.
Right.
Just like Obama exceeded Bush, which just like Bush exceeded Clinton.
And then the court upholds Obama and says Trump can't undo Obama.
Right. Even though it's all illegal.
Ridiculous, right? We're upholding his illegal actions. It becomes madness.
It becomes not following the law, instead following or making the decision to get the outcome they want.
And not having the courage to follow the law, which is where the Supreme Court is, right? Because with Obamacare, they knew Obamacare was, everybody knows it's unconstitutional. It's very clear that it's unconstitutional. This healthcare just is not in the realm. Mandatory healthcare is not in the realm of the federal government. But yet it would cause too much disruption, so the Supreme Court didn't want to get involved. Right. And so they say something and they use reasoning, which now it's going to come around again, and they've eliminated that reasoning, and they're still going to say that Obamacare is constitutional, even though it's clearly not.
Right.
Because nobody's willing to say, I'll fall on my sword if I have to, but I'm going to enforce the law.
Right.
And that's what the church has to start demanding and has to start expecting, is that we elect leaders that took an oath of office, took an oath before God to uphold the Constitution. And we should be praying to God that God starts to judge people for violating his oath. In reality, we're seeing it.
There was a Viking in the Capitol building, sitting in the seat. And we don't think that this is the judgment of God. If you wrote 2020 and 2021 as a novel and took it to an editor and said, "Hey, would you publish this?" They would look at you like you're nuts. No, this is too over the top. We can't. No, you got to dial it back. We're being judged by God. God is giving us over to madness.
And so it comes back to the church.
Right.
So if we want to solve the problem, how do you solve the problem? And one thing I would argue is the church no longer says Micah 6:8. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly before your God. Instead, they say, love mercy, walk humbly before God. And they don't think justice has anything to do with it. But God is a just God, and the church isn't reflecting the character of God. The church isn't shining light. It isn't being salt unless it's just. And it has to start being just inside. But this is the solution. This is the only solution, which ties directly to the gospel, not to reject what Joshua said before. But the church has to start demanding justice. But the church doesn't care about justice any more than the state.
And to tie it to the gospel, the church has been saying that the gospel and law are at odds with each other. And that's how we get here. We get here when we say that the law is against the good things of God, meaning the gospel, the good news.
Right.
And when you start saying that within your church, that God's law, that thank goodness we're done with that. Thank goodness that now we live under love, not under law. Despite everything that the New Testament says, where Jesus himself, right before he goes up into heaven, says, teach them everything I've commanded you. Now when we
teach them to do everything I commanded,
right.
Not just teach them, but teach them to do
everything I've commanded. When we get to the point where we think law and gospel are at war with each other, and we start trying to talk about gospel without law, we're not really going to have any gospel to talk about. And without any law, you get this.
When you read Romans 13, when Paul writes that, everything in the law, do not murder, do not commit adultery, all of it is summed up in this: love your neighbor as yourself. We all need to recognize, if you lose law, you always lose love. That is, Jesus Christ said it in Matthew 24, right? That lawlessness will abound, so the love of many will grow cold. This is the pattern that always happens. When you get lawlessness, you have rejected what it means to love your neighbor, which means you don't love your neighbor. And so when the church is going, the gospel's at the opposite, or is in opposition to the law, what it's really saying is loving your neighbor is in opposition to the gospel, which Jesus Christ said the opposite. And this is where we are. We're at the point where we're saying loving your neighbor isn't necessary because we have the gospel. No, we need to know how to love our neighbor. And that's what we're seeing break down.
And there's this, there's a real part of it where the church considers itself irrelevant. The church, you think about it like if Congress refused to meet because of the coronavirus, people would say, you need to do your jobs. Do your jobs. And the church considers itself irrelevant. The church doesn't think they have anything to do with the nation. The church thinks they have nothing to do with the love of the nation. And that's totally against Scripture. That's totally against everything the Bible says. And so there's this part of it where the church needs to do their job. I mean, the church really needs to do their job. They need to meet. They need to exhort one another to love and good works, because that changes a nation. And so if you want to look at this, there's a real part of, one of the things I love about the Reformed faith is it's sort of like a calculus that helps you understand the world. You can actually take things, you can see the world, and you can say, this makes sense. Today on my Facebook feed, I've seen more people posting, what we need is love. What we need is love. But no one said, and I need to post it, if you see love not being there, it's because lawlessness abounds. If you want love, you need to increase people's appreciation for law, or you won't have it. If you want love, that's what has to happen. And the church has to be the one that does it.
You know, I was at dinner with somebody this evening, and a couple, and the wife said that, you know, if she hadn't been attending Reformation, that she'd be the person that was scared to death sitting at home. That doesn't mean she wasn't a Christian. That means that the interaction of people are a check on the conspiracy theories. They're a check on the fear. They're a check on viewing the world. And what's happened with the coronavirus is that check's been removed. And it's largely, in a lot of ways, it's been removed before that, where people don't actually interact with one another very much in the church. But that is the check, because even those who are Christians, they get misled, not eternally, but they get misled for a season unless they have the brothers and sisters to be a check on them. Right. The body needs each other. The hand needs the foot. The eye needs the hand. And there are people right now that can look at the situation and see the reality of it, but they're not interacting with the people that are the hands that are out there doing the work. So the people that are the hands, they're going, look at this, is horrible, blah, 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 instead of having the check of somebody that has more discernment going, whoa, 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 this is what's really happening.
Right.
And so the church is losing it internally and not just its influence externally.
I mean, when you see the people who went in, I mean, when you were talking, what I was thinking was the people who went into the Capitol were the hands and the feet for some percentage of an assembly.
People that broke into the Capitol, they're considering themselves the fist of that body.
Right.
Because, like Joshua said, his brother, my son, was there, not to break in, but my son was there to try to document what was happening. But watching it, he said that the crowd that broke into the Capitol was distinctly different than the crowd at the mall.
Right.
The crowd at the mall was a lot more 60-year-olds. The crowd at the Capitol was a lot more 20-year-olds.
Vikings.
There was a dramatic shift. But these people are saying, we see the elderly here that are upset. They can't do anything about it, but we'll go swing the fist. And so they saw themselves as the fist.
Right. There's been very much a negation of leadership. The idea of going in and invading the Capitol, it's sort of a nonsense thing. The people in the Capitol aren't inaccessible to you. Donald Trump is the president right now. You know what I mean? I mean, there is this part of it where, I mean, there's this mixed up, messed up idea that they have to break into the. I mean, and I'm not trying to defend them, but I am saying there is this part of it where they felt like this was the right thing to do, and it's completely it's a very twisted form of logic, if that makes sense.
And I'm concerned that it's not that twisted form of logic, in the sense that if you marginalize a group of people enough, those people start to go, what other recourse do I have? The media has been calling them racists. The media has been calling them Nazis. The media has been saying, basically, these are people that should be destroyed. And then all of a sudden the power shifts to the other side. And you've heard for 4 years how you're people that should be destroyed. There's a point where you go, I need to defend myself. And that's not to say that they're right, but my point is there is real logic there. We spent $4.6 trillion destroying the Nazis. If they think that the other side really thinks they're Nazis, they should expect to be killed. And we know they won't hesitate to kill. They killed 1.5 million babies last year. We know they don't hesitate to kill. So if you're sitting there with that reasoning and not trusting in God, not trusting in the sovereignty of God, not trusting in the way you're blessed is by keeping the law, which is what God says.
Being left to your own
if you reject it
fears.
and all of a sudden you're doing what's right in your own eyes, what they're doing isn't irrational in their own eyes, because they're saying these people want to kill us, because that's what they've been saying for the last 4 years.
And tying all that together, Joshua's comment in your comment, that was the book of Judges. Because there was no king in Israel, every man did what was right in his own eyes. It says it over and over and over. And we're at the point where, yes, because there's a dearth of leadership. And because we're there, and because we've got these groups that are marginalized, and then on top of that, throw on that you've spent all summer saying that violent actions are an acceptable form of political expression with all of the Black
For a
Lives...
marginalized group.
Right, for all the Black Lives Matter groups, for the Occupy Portland groups, it's been going on all summer, and all of a sudden we're going to be surprised. And again, this is not excusing, this is not condoning. It was bad, but there are explanations out there for it.
Yeah, I mean, marginalized is not limited to Trump supporters. I mean, like you were saying, I mean,
Right.
Black Lives Matter, that is the whole thing. Is we are marginalized people. And some of it is kind of, for both of them, it's false. You have the first black president, and then you still have a large movement saying black people are marginalized. You have Trump supporters of the sitting president saying we're marginalized, even though in the last election we put the president into office. So there's some truth to both of them, there's some falsehood to both of them. But we have to make sure the way we're treating marginalized groups applies to both Black Lives Matter and Trump supporters. And that's a hard thing to do, because one of them, who everyone in the country probably sympathizes with one of those groups a lot more than the other.
And where that comes back to is no partiality in the law. The law has to be enforced evenly. It has to not be for one side or the other side. And that's the point of resolution. That the law has to be just. It has to be fair. It has to say, I don't care about skin color. I don't care about wealth. I don't care about what I'm going to do is justice, which is what the Bible teaches. But the church isn't teaching that. So how would the society know?
Right. And it's, I mean, one of the answers is yes, the people who did this yesterday should be prosecuted under the law.
And it would be best if Donald Trump did it.
Right, and they should be prosecuted for what they did, because there are people out there like calling for their execution, or they're calling.
Well, it was treason, Charles, treason.
And so, you know, what I mean, it's kind of like some of them literally just walked in behind a group of others. Some of them didn't push past any police officer, didn't do anything, and some of them were right at the forefront. They were throwing things at police officers. They were pushing down barricades. Some of them did, you know, I think there was not a lot of property damage, but you can see people stealing things. There are laws that govern those things. They should be prosecuted under the law. That would be absolutely right.
It would be absolutely right, but it becomes very dangerous if it's just on one side.
Yes.
And what the society needs to start to demand. And I hope it's going to happen in Portland. I mean, the governor of Oregon said that he's going to start to push for it, but the district attorneys aren't prosecuting the laws. But if it's just on one side, that gets to be a problem too, because that's just going to go, they're out to get us.
Right.
And so we have to be demanding just judgment. And we have to demand it of judges, and we have to stop the lie that the chief of the Supreme Court, Roberts, said, where there are no Obama judges and there are no Trump judges. Of course there are.
Right.
We need to stop pretending like there's unbiased people. There's systems that are put in place to prevent the biases to take over. But this country wasn't founded on a naive view of human nature. The reason that we have checks and balances, and by and far the primary check and balance was between the federal government and the states, not the House, not the legislative branch and
Right.
the executive branch. And when we lost that, that's caused all kinds of problems.
I actually do think Donald Trump should lead the charge to prosecute the people that should break in. But there is this part of it where you cannot let any group sit down and say, we are the standard for normalcy. No, or our behavior is the standard for what is acceptable. No, the law is the standard for what is acceptable. Because that's exactly your point, is if you let one group do that just by their nature, you end up being biased, you end up being partial, you end up being unjust.
And I think, what happened in the 2016 election and the 2020 election seems to me to be pretty clear. In the 2016 election, Donald Trump manipulated the media so they covered him all the time, and he won. So the media this time decided, we're not going to allow that, so they manipulated Donald Trump and won. And we just need to recognize that when this goes on, that people have to start to judge justly and not allow one person to respond by doing the same sin that the other person did, and back and forth, and it keeps escalating. It's the same with executive orders. It's the same with the control of the media. I mean, this is where we are as a nation, and the church needs to stand up and say, stop. This is wicked. This is evil. And this will destroy the country.
So our sermon last Sunday at church was on the first commandment, and one of the examples that was brought up was the fact that in America today there is a large cult of Trump, a large idolatry of the president. And it's something that if you don't trust in God, it'd be pretty frightening, the amount of people who are following Trump and worship him as a god.
And on the other side, there's a significant percentage of people who idolize the government itself. And so, I mean, you've got those kind of competing idolatries.
Among many, many others.
Right.
But it is kind of interesting because a lot of the ones that idolize Trump are not the ones who idolize the government.
Right.
It's kind of contradictory.
It is.
But what we are saying is this is also the reaction to an idol falling, right? I mean, there's people that are going, how can you not see Trump as God? They're not using those words, but that's how they're looking at him. So they're going, there's no way he lost the election. It's just impossible. Because how could he lose the election? He's Donald Trump.
And at the same time, there's all the hand-wringing about it. What happened at the Capitol building is, how can you not see the state as God? Why would you dare assault that idol?
I mean, some of the reaction of our representatives is purely because all of a sudden they felt threatened for the first time. In some way. I mean, it's one of those things. I mean, when someone goes through something, when you see someone else having a difficult time, and then it happens to you, it becomes real in a very different way. And it's very easy to be incredibly offended when it happens to you. And it wouldn't surprise me if there's a part of it where that's part of what's going on with the representatives is they came into our house. These people came into our house. And like I said, again, it was very wrong for them to do it, but there is a part of it where they're looking at it as they are incredibly offended that such a thing could happen.
And it is a valid landmark. I mean, how many other times have guns been drawn on people on the House floor? I mean, it goes in the history books when you have guns pulled on people breaking into the Capitol building. But
when you have people taking selfies by the statues in the statutory hall and stuff, I mean, there was an aspect that it was a lark at the same time. I mean, they didn't have an agenda. They weren't really there to accomplish anything. Maybe to disrupt It strikes me that they're angry people that didn't know what to do with their anger. So they broke into the Capitol, and they got in the Capitol, and they kind of went, now what do we do? And some of them went, hey, let's throw some books around in Pelosi's office. And some said Pence should stand up, and he should say, I have the constitutional right to overthrow electoral votes. But what did they really do? They weren't trying to do an insurrection. They weren't trying to do a coup. What they were doing was they didn't know what to do. They kind of made it. The police said, don't go here. So they said, how dare you tell us you're on the Capitol side? So we're just going to go around you, and we're going to climb up the scaffolding, and we'll prove that you can't stop us. And then they get inside and kind of go, what now? And the answer was nothing.
They're angry people who've been locked up for 9 months, who haven't been allowed to go to their jobs, who haven't been allowed to go to their movies or their amusement parks or just do the normal things that they would do. And all of a sudden, here's an opportunity to party. And, hey.
And have your picture standing on the pedestal of a statue.
And it wouldn't shock me at all if in the back of some of these representatives' mind was basically this phrase, some of our playthings have gotten out of control. You know what I mean? I mean, there is a real part of it where it's like, that the people need to know that they don't get to come in here. And so, I mean, there is a real part of, like I said, and without any excuse for the people doing what they're doing, both sides can be completely wrong in their attitudes. And it's really easy for them to have zero empathy for people that many of them have whipped into this frenzy. You know what I mean? They are partly responsible with their lies for the way that these people feel on both sides. For the ones who have said, just shut up and sit down, you're white, you're entitled, blah, blah. Whatever they've had to say to them. And, that's all very relevant. So, I think both sides can be completely wrong. If the Garden of Eden taught us anything, there's not 100% blame and you figure out how to spread it around. No, you can all be 100% wrong.
And I think an interesting point there is people are made to feel this a certain way, so they're acting in a certain way. And I think that's something that a lot of people across the country get wrong is I feel a certain way, you make me feel a certain way, therefore I'm justified in doing certain things. Well, feeling and justice and righteous actions are not connected. Your feelings are independent from what is the right thing for you to be doing.
Yes.
One thing I think that, we talked about lawlessness in terms of the riots and stuff. One of the biggest reasons that I think there's a bunch of angry people is what Jonathan just said. They've been locked down for 9 months, and most of those lockdowns were completely illegal. They didn't have the right to do it. They didn't have the law on their side, but yet they go, we have the power. We can force it. We'll ignore what the legislature says. We'll ignore what everybody says. As the governor, I'm going to be your tyrant. I'm going to do what I want to do. And so the people are going, well, they can lock us in prison in our house for 3 months, for 4 months, for 9 months. They think that they own us. So why wouldn't you get angry at that?
Right.
Because this is the big lawlessness of 2020 was not them not arresting the people who were breaking windows at the riots. The big lawlessness of 2020 was the failure of the governors to say, even in the midst of a pandemic, we have to obey the law.
Right. That people have rights. That
people
have
have rights, that the church has rights. And they ignore that and they violate that. And the people are going, if they can lock us in house arrest for months without any habeas corpus, without any recourse on our side at all, they don't think there's any limit to their power. So why shouldn't we be angry?
Right. I mean, one of the things that's been recurring in my head over and over is just that this whole season with coronavirus, with Donald Trump, with everything, there's been a lot of like chickens coming home to roost for a lot of people. The church has spent years running and playing games, pretending like things don't matter, pretending like doctrine doesn't matter, pretending like the law doesn't matter, pretending like you can just say it's not about rules, it's about relationship. And guess what? This is your comeuppance. The government has been spending all this time saying that we can say whatever we want. It doesn't matter. We can spend wildly. We can do, and this is your comeuppance. And so there's a lot of comeuppance. There's a whole lot of comeuppance happening.
Do not be deceived. God is not mocked.
Yes.
What a man sows, that he will also reap.
Yes.
And you sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind.
Right.
And good grief, there it is. We've been sowing it for a long time, and we got a little taste of it.
God
That's
is
what I think
merciful.
we got a little taste of it. This is not the whirlwind.
Right.
The whirlwind, we should have every expectation that the whirlwind is coming.
But it feels like it right now.
Right, because we're so used to calm.
We're so used to a calm and peaceful transition of power. We have had decades, centuries of peaceful transitions of power ever since the U.S. Civil War. It's been pretty easy to vote one president out and bring another one in. And it's hard to look at any other country anywhere in the world where you can move from one political system to another where everybody's shaking hands and smiling for the photo ops. And now that we get a little taste of, hey, we actually don't like each other that much. And you think that I'm a terrible person because I'm on this side, and I think you're a terrible person, and are you even human because you're on that side? And sure, that's where we are.
Right. Because in the end, the law is the one thing that you can't shake hands over if you don't agree on the law. You know what I mean? There comes a point.
You can't bring peace without
Right.
having an agreement of what the rules are.
Right. And there's this part of it where, you can shake hands over differences of what the law should be. You can shake hands over, you can say, well, we disagree. We're going to push on these different things. But if there's a part of it where you think the other side is saying, I'm going to get away with anything I can get away with, how do you, if both sides are saying that, how do you smoothly walk past each other? How do you actually shake hands? There's nothing to shake hands over.
And what we're seeing now is that, it's just an incredible escalation. What happened yesterday, Donald Trump said, go to the Capitol. He didn't say break in. And I understand there was some inciting there. I'm not saying that he's completely innocent. But at the same time, he then later posts a video saying, yeah, you're right, but go home, be peaceful. Twitter and Facebook bring it down because they say he was inciting violence. And yet you can argue that he should have been more bold about saying to leave. But in the end, he didn't say, go do violence. He said, go be peaceful. But yet the reaction is, and the story that's been told is, Donald Trump can't speak to you for the next 15 days,
Ever.
2 weeks.
He can never
Yeah,
speak
some
to
of
you
them,
again.
it's indefinite of when they're going to allow him to be there. And if you cut off his voice, there will be more reaction.
Right.
And it's not going to be good. And so what they're doing is, by saying it's a coup when it wasn't a coup, by saying it's an insurrection when it was an insurrection, when they say Donald Trump, just like at Charlottesville where Donald Trump said, I'm not talking about the white racists, they go, oh, he's blowing a dog whistle. He's talking about the white racists. It's all about the white racists. Where they take the language and twist it and say, therefore, that voice can't be heard. That's a really dangerous escalation.
Right.
And Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they all really escalated today. And I'm wondering what the results will be. That's why I don't think we've got the whirlwind. And I'm not saying you said we were. We're just saying a little, we see a storm cloud and we think it's the whirlwind. We should just wait, because if this is the battle that goes back and forth, it's going to get uglier.
Right.
And we should think nobody's trying to de-escalate. They're intentionally escalating. What they should have done is put Donald Trump on there saying, go home and be peaceful, and say, instead of saying, let's invoke the 25th Amendment and remove him from the presidency. Let's impeach him. Are you nuts? They can't do impeachment in 14 days. These are just lies.
Famous
to try
last
to stir.
words.
Well, they can't do it anyway, because there's no way they would get 34, that they can't, 35 senators or whatever they need to stop the impeachment. It's not going to happen. I mean, the conviction for the impeachment. He's not going to be removed from office. It's just not going to happen.
Right.
But yet this is the language they're using. We should be really careful that our elected leaders aren't trying to stir up trouble, because these are the words that you choose, and I think a lot of them are chosen by the media, but these are the words you choose to stir up more trouble,
Right.
not to calm down. And you don't have any statesmen that are standing up saying, calm down. This wasn't an insurrection. The government, Biden's voting was still certified. He'll still be, inaugurated on the 20th. All this stuff, yeah, it was a show, but it's not that significant. Instead of saying, this was an insurrection, we're all going to die, we have to get rid of Trump. I mean, the hysteria is contagious, and they should be careful.
I mean, I think you do have a lot of people trying to be statesmen and saying that. Unfortunately, most, if not all of them, have already burned all their credibility with significant portions of the country. Because there were people trying to say all those things, but the people that they're talking to are not listening to them.
Right.
But what I'm saying is that the right-wingers need to say that about Biden, and the left-wingers need to say that about Trump. And they need to go to the other side of the aisle and stop being so partial in their judgment for their own side, or they will increase the divisions. But when you say our whole system is systematically racist, they're saying everybody on the other side is a racist. I mean, they need to fix their language. The language really matters, and the language of bias that is so prevalent throughout our whole system and throughout all what's acceptable, and they act like it's just Donald Trump. No, it's as much any of the Democrats as it is Donald Trump. I'm not saying Donald Trump's good in his use of language, quite the opposite, but there's this bias that needs to stop, or it's going to get worse.
And then you have millions of Republicans begging the vice president to do a coup and to declare unilaterally that he picks the next president, and it's going to be Trump. I mean, the idea that the vice president is going to pick the next president, which is what people are asking for. They're not saying that, but that's what it comes down to, is the vice president picks the next president. I mean, it's insane.
And Donald Trump was, I think he was pushing that.
Yeah, he's
he's escalating as much as
he kept
anybody.
saying over and over and over, Pence can do this. Pence can do this. And it's just madness.
Right. He doesn't care about the Constitution.
Right.
I mean, I did notice that Jonathan Turley wrote an article today that said, hey, we need to appoint a presidential commission to actually go and figure out what actually happened, do a legitimate investigation, a bipartisan, figure out, was the election stolen? We should appoint a presidential commission that's balanced between the parties, and let's investigate and find out what happened. Because it's light that will stop this continual escalation. It's not darkness that will do it. And both sides are not pointing towards bringing light to the situation. They're just saying, let's have our partisan side. We'll say our story, and we don't want it to be checked.
Sounds like you shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free.
And if we don't want to know the truth, we'll be slaves. And that's where we are as a nation. We're becoming more and more enslaved. Enslaved by our passions, because we have no check on our passions. Because the law and the gospel are the checks on the passions.
Right. Because lawlessness abounds, the love of many grows cold. And you have to realize that this is the nature of man. And it goes all the way back to the garden. But look at the next thing that happened right after the garden. Is the very first son kills the very first brother with Cain and Abel. That's what we are as human beings who are driven by sin. The nature of human beings, apart from the gospel of Jesus Christ, is conflict. The nature of human beings is to marginalize one another, to hate one another, to be violent against one another, even to the point of the shedding of blood. And so what we're seeing right now is just some of the restraints on our natural man being removed. And as you have law removed, as you have gospel removed, this is what you get. And the more you remove those, the more of this you get, the more violence you get. And you can try and prop it up with whatever ideals you want. They don't work very long. Maybe you can prop up equality. Maybe you can prop up diversity. Maybe you can prop up the love of democracy. And you can get people to buy it for a little bit. But while they're buying it for a little bit, you know what they're doing? They're sinning. Every last one of them, they're sinning. They are sinners at heart. And because of that, because they're sinners, their guilt increases, their envy increases, their lust for power or things or position. All of these things are just building and building and building. And unless those things are destroyed by the gospel, you're just going to get these outpourings of violence. And this was a pretty tame one. In the history of the world, this is a pretty tame one. It seems like the biggest thing to us.
Because we don't know our history very well.
Because we don't know our history very well. We've lived in a very civilized country that's been pretty well behaved for most of our lifetimes. And so this seems like a really big deal because it's not normal. But this is actually what we're like. God is giving us a little mirror to show this is what you are. You hate each other. And the only way that you get past that is you get the gospel of Jesus Christ.
I was listening to a book about Paris in the early 19th century. In Paris in the early 19th century, they went, wow, we went 12 years without riots that destroyed the city. That's Paris. And the riots were pretty regular.
City of love.
Yeah. And so when we think about that, we also need to recognize that the reason that we sit here and go, wow, wasn't this shocking, is because the gospel has had a huge influence here. That's why the city hasn't burned down a bunch of times before, is because of the influence of the gospel. And so we just need to recognize that what we're saying is the effect of the gospel. It's the constraint. And even as the constraint's still being lifted, we're very constrained. But something else about Cain and Abel, right? There was basically one law, and Abel kept it and Cain didn't, right? Mm-hmm. How do you sacrifice to God? And Abel had to be willing to risk his life in order to say the law matters. And the reality is, this is how the country changes, is Christians have to be willing to say, I will risk my job, I will risk my life, I will risk my name, I will risk things for the gospel to give an example of what it looks like. And as long as the Christians aren't willing to risk obedience to the law, then it's not going to change. And I see a lot of Christians that they're not that interested in the law. They just are interested in their side winning instead of saying, this is what's right. And some of these are laws like, do not forsake the gathering together of the saints. And the church was really quick to say the law of man overrules the law of God. This man's opinion is more important than God's opinion. Well, this is a serious thing.
Right.
And do you say, who are we going to obey? And if you obey, people are saying you're trying to murder me. And do the slings and arrows bother you, or do you just say, but I'm going to do the right thing in the eyes of God? And to turn the society around, there has to be Christians that are willing to say, I will get fired to do the right thing. I will lose father and mother to do the right thing. I will write all the divisions that Christ said that you had to suffer. The Christians don't think we should suffer those things. But that's actually how you say these things matter. Right now the church is saying none of these things matter. None of them are worth dying for. None of them are worth risking anything for. So how do you establish law without the church, without the people of God saying we worship the lawgiver?
And when you establish law, I mean, go back to the 10 Commandments. Go back to the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. And I'm not saying this is the first time it's happened. I'm not saying it's the only time. But just a few days earlier, the first day of this Congress, January 3rd, was opened with a prayer, which we approve of, opening Congress with prayer.
Not that prayer.
Not that prayer. I mean, you've heard.
Brahma.
Yeah, you heard about this prayer. This is the one that ended with Amen and all women, and everybody made fun of that a little bit because it's silly. I mean, it's just nobody thinks that anybody
Oh, it was respectful to the congresswoman.
right.
That was his argument. Anyway.
But just before that, he's invoking the names of pagan gods.
We ask it in the name of the monotheistic God, Brahma, and God known by many names by many different faiths. A man and a woman.
And it's in that seat that somebody just a few days later sits wearing no shirt, dressed up like a Viking.
Going back to that Viking, aren't you?
But I mean, God is not mocked. And when you just say, hey, we're going to call upon any God, God's going to clear your chamber. And you know, it's, again, this isn't the first time that something's happened where somebody's invoked the name of another God in the U.S. Congress. Right. It's not going to be the last time that they do it. But
it was one of the more prominent times.
It was a prominent time. It was the opening session.
And I just mean because he said the amen. And I mean, how often have you read the opening prayers of Congress? I may have read one or two in my lifetime,
watch
but
the
I
YouTube
read
video.
Every one I've heard is horrible. I've heard a few horrible.
Right, but you don't usually go to it. But now all of a sudden, like everybody in the country is talking about how stupid it is. So that's what I meant by prominence. Not even the first session. It's that a lot of people know about it.
Right. And one of the things that we want to do is we want to say everything that happened is about the nature of human conflict that day. And really, God may be telling us that, hey, this is not just about human conflict. This is because you refuse to acknowledge me. And because you refuse to acknowledge me as God, I will do what I have always done and what I've told you I will do. I will give you over to madness. And so here you go. Here's a small dose of it. It's our chance. It's our opportunity. We could repent.
To be humbled.
We could be humbled. We could go back to commandment number 1 of having no other gods before him. We could acknowledge God as God, honor him and him only. Yeah. Or we can keep worshiping other gods. We can keep following after other gods, ones that we actually name like Brahman, or ones that we just kind of, we worship them as idols, but we don't call them that. Or we could actually go back and we could worship the one true God.
And God gives promises, right? Kings of earth, kiss the Son, lest you perish along the way.
Lest God be angry
and you perish along the way. I mean, the reality is God does care if the civil magistrate shows him honor, not belief, because to kiss the Son does not require that you are a faithful believer, but it means you're showing respect to God. And like you said, on the opening session, there was no respect shown to God.
Right.
And there were people mocking him for saying amen and a woman, but there weren't many people going, no, there is not one monotheistic God that we all serve called Brahma. There's not true. Right. I mean, that was what the prayer said. And I don't see any of the Christians, congressmen going, how dare you blaspheme the name of my God?
Right.
But how many people in churches go, how dare you blaspheme the name of my God? And until we start caring about God's name, we should expect further judgment.
And if you have a space, just a room where people gather, but you refuse to acknowledge God there, why do you think that God would honor that? Why do you think that God would honor the proceedings of that room? And this is not justifying anything that happened. All this is saying is that God can use all sorts of extraordinary means.
Just like the Babylonians burning his temple.
He can use the Babylonians, he can use the Assyrians, he can use the Romans, he can use Herod, he can use Nero. God can use any one of these really wicked peoples, to act as his axe, if you will, to fell a tree.
But there is hope. We talked about it in the last episode, but we see hope. We see churches that are there's been more civil disobedience, godly civil disobedience in the last year than for an awful long time in American history. I saw an article today about a whole elder board of a church in Canada were all served with fines of up to $10,000 because they said we're going to meet. And so there is a remnant.
And sometimes that remnant needs to be slapped upside the head to understand what God is doing. And God chastens. He chastens his church. He chastens his people. And like all these things, like we talked about last week, we can either feel the rod upon our back and respond and find the peaceable fruits of righteousness, or it gets worse. And the church needs to repent. And it's very clear in ways that the church needs to repent, or our society wouldn't be where it is.
Yeah. Are we keeping the Sabbath? Are we doing the, are we obeying, are the people of God obeying God's laws?
Are we doing justice? Are we
Right.
loving mercy?
Because
are we walking humbly before our God or not?
And to do justly, right? You mentioned the Sabbath, but to do justly is to give your servants the day off. It is. I mean,
Right.
These are inherent to justice. They're not separate. It's very unjust to make an idol that you cause people to bow down and worship. That's being unjust. It's not. All the laws are about justice.
Right.
And we've lost that idea, in especially due process. Due process is supposed to be about justice. And our nation has all kinds of due process laws because of our Christian heritage. And we should expect them all to be lost the way that we're going, unless the church starts to say, there is a just process, and we need to go back to it.
I think that's a big part of when people say, what can I do? And when you look back through Scripture, when God brings deliverance, it's usually not one person taking up a sword and going out and killing someone. It's a small number of people actually honoring God and obeying Him. And then God brings deliverance. It's a small number, And so if you want to ask, what can I actually do? It's in your home, keep the Sabbath. In your home, teach your children the Word of God. In your home, honor God where you have authority. In your church, be just. And God will bring deliverance.
In the workplace, be just where it actually costs you financially. Start to be fair in your judgment of others instead of being biased towards yourself. Work to be impartial. Right. Work to say, impartiality is an abomination before God, and I'm going to work to be impartial and not just say I'm going to do everything that I can for myself. That's sin. Esteeming others better than yourself is the gospel.
Right.
And these are the basic things that people can do. And the reality is, if you start to shine forth the light, the darkness flees pretty easily.
Right.
Resist the devil and he will flee from you. It's not like there's this huge battle that we have to do. And yes, because it's hard to resist the devil, you need to put on the armor of God, and I'm not rejecting any of that. But the reality is, light beats darkness every time.
Right.
It's just that we're failing to be light. And what we need to do is be diligent to be light, especially in being lawful, especially in being just. If we want the world to stop being on fire, if we want to put the fire out, it starts by being light.
I mean, if you really want to understand what the phrase do justly and love mercy means, as soon as you take the law of God and aim it at yourself, you'll love the mercy of God because He's shown you a tremendous amount of mercy. That's the first step of doing justly and loving mercy. It's not going out in the world and taking the axe and taking the sword and putting everybody else to death with God's law. It's turning the law of God towards you and seeing how you have failed, how I have failed. And as soon as you do that, you love the mercy of God because you've received it and you see it all over the place. I mean, and you start to see these verses that God said actually make sense as opposed to them just being things that you say. Your faith actually starts to become real because you actually love the Word of God and you love the working out of it in the world.
And when Jesus Christ says, pull the plank out of your own eye before you pull the speck out of your brother's eye. When you pull the plank out of your eye, you're loving justice. And when you pull the speck out of your brother's eye, you're loving justice and you're loving mercy. Because you pull it out in a different way if you first apply the law to yourself.
Right.
Because once you first apply the law to yourself, then you can show care for your brother to rightly do justly, but to do it in a way that loves mercy. And if we won't apply it to ourselves, we end up never loving mercy. And we don't ever really end up loving justice either because we're being partial.
Right.
Well, thank you for joining us. It's an important topic. And as we think of the church and its view towards the law, it's really important to remember what Jesus Christ said, is that when lawlessness abounds, the love of many will grow cold. We're seeing that in our nation around us. May we learn how to love each other. Thank you for joining us.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.